Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage Emily Parker.
Hello, this is a really special panel we have right now. As you know, one of the biggest topics in crypto is regulation, and particularly regulation here in the United States, which is very complicated, very divisive, and there's a lot to talk about. So I'm thrilled to announce our inaugural Lawmakers Town Hall. And joining us today, we have Jesse Hamilton, CoinDesk's Deputy Managing Editor for Global Policy and Regulation, who will be joined by Senators Kirsten Gillibrand, Cynthia Lummis, and Pat Toomey is apparently on his way. He will be joining us at some point. And Representative Patrick McHenry. Thank you so much.
All right. Hello, Consensus. How you guys doing out there?
Hey.
So, welcome to our panel today. It's called Washington's Crypto Awakening, which I've been covering this for a couple years now, and I think that's a good way to put it. I think this is Washington's Crypto Awakening. Now, we're fortunate to have some highly influential voices in that awakening. Now, they're here from Washington, where consensus is, frankly, a little hard to come by. But we'll see if we can find some here today.
How many consensus jokes are we going to have?
That's my only one, I swear.
Oh, good, good.
So we have, obviously, we've been seeing, crypto worlds have been seeing a lot from these senators. We have Senators Kirsten Gillibrand and Cynthia Lummis, who together just released the text of a bill this week that could provide some foundation for rules of the crypto road that eventually come from DC. And Senator Gillibrand, at the end here, who you'll recall as a presidential candidate a few years ago, represents New York, where they have a thing called Wall Street, but is also on the Senate's Agriculture Committee that oversees U.S. commodities regulation, which might figure strongly into the futures of people in this room. And beside her, we have Senator Lummis from Wyoming. I think the senator's pretty well known to this world by now. She's reliably raised digital assets issues at every turn on Capitol Hill. And she's a member of the Senate Banking Committee, so that oversees the SEC and other regulators, so a key position. Now, we have an empty chair on the stage, obviously. Senator Pat Toomey is allegedly on his way and should be here in a few minutes. So, we'll talk about him when he gets here. But fingers crossed he gets here. And finally, we have Congressman Patrick McHenry, the ranking Republican on House Financial Services Committee, has pushed some highly relevant legislation on how the government could define crypto brokers. And some of that language has been used for the bill that came out this week. So he may have some things to say about that. And he's, Congressman McHenry is from North Carolina and is obviously the sole person on the stage representing the House. So we'll have to lean on him to give us some insight from that chamber. So the bottom line is digital assets legislation emerges at some point from Washington as a law, it's likely that the people on the stage will have their fingerprints on it. And we're going to find out today what that might look like, hopefully, and how they intend to get there. So obviously, thanks so much for being here today with us. who would have thought that that Washington would be the frigid, cold North compared to what we're seeing here. So thanks for braving the conditions. But as we get to the questions, I would encourage you guys to weigh in on each other's answers and keep this as decentralized. This is a crypto space. We're going to keep it decentralized, right? So in that vein, I'm going to ask for some audience help here. Now, obviously you all, or maybe I should say y'all from Texas, are the serious people in the crypto space, right? But I'm going to give permission to put that aside. I want to hear booing from anyone who thinks that they'd rather not have Washington mixed up in crypto. So I'll also accept hissing. Let's go.
Ooh, yeah.
Oh, nice. All right. So now on the flip side, let's hear some applause for those who think it's high time that Washington come up with some guardrails. Okay. So the answer's pretty clear, right? So let's go ahead, and because it's definitely the news of the moment, let's talk about this piece of legislation out Tuesday, right? Very significant, very comprehensive bill to cover crypto. Senator Lummis, I think your name is first in the shorthand of this, Lummis Gillibrand. Can you go ahead and tell us about that bill, and especially any important details that maybe we missed in some of the rush of early coverage this week?
It is very comprehensive, and it takes the existing regulatory framework for traditional assets, and we just lay the cryptocurrency world on top of those. So for the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, they will be regulating digital assets that are commodities for the spot market and the futures market. For digital assets or cryptocurrencies that are securities, they will be doing the disclosure component, because the SEC is very good at disclosing for consumer protection purposes what's going on with different assets. The taxation components are addressed. The definitions, which are very important, are addressed. And so we are attempting to bring to the floor of the Senate sort of its first opportunity to look at this broadly, including stablecoins and testing the notion of a CDBC with regard to some studies. So it's very comprehensive, but very based on our current structure for regulating traditional assets.
So, to be candid here, despite our best efforts, there honestly weren't a lot of Democratic lawmakers enthusiastic to sit on a crypto conference stage. So it's maybe left the field a little bit unbalanced today. But Senator Gillibrand, if you could give us some insight into whether you think Democrats such as yourself will be willing in the end to come to the table, and why they would.
So I think this is a great opportunity for everyone here at Consensus to talk about the vision of the future of this industry. There is so much opportunity to create business models, to expand reach for access to capital. The thing that's so wonderful about decentralized finance is you don't need the intermediary of a bank or an institution. You can have access to capital immediately. You can send capital worldwide instantaneously. You can help people in Ukraine. You can send remittances to your family abroad. You can do all these things that, unfortunately, for a lot of Americans, there's massive barriers. Barriers to entry, having to have a bank account. Hello, Senator Toomey.
There's Senator Pat Toomey.
Hey, Pat.
How are you?
Crashing the stage like a rock star.
So right now, that's one part of blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies. Another part that's exciting is that it's opened up a whole new avenue for the art world. NFTs is a growing industry. It's very exciting for artists, for vendors, for participants. And then you also have the ability of blockchain to use for democratization. I met with colleagues in Oakland, California, who are using tokens to give to citizens, to give them access to capital, access to voting, organizing, access to community building. So there's really unlimited application for blockchain technology and DeFi. And so the important part of this effort is to recognize the potential and then build a structural framework around it so that we have basic rules of the road, so that the United States can be a jurisdiction where there's reliability, where there's safety and soundness, where there's transparency and accountability, where there is consumer protection. And that's what Cynthia and I tried to do in this legislation, is write that for the country, the industry, and so we don't have regulatory arbitrage. We don't want this market going to other countries that are just better at getting it set up and making it easier and more transparent for consumers. We want that industry here. And that's why definitions were important. It's why we were very clear about what's a commodity and what satisfies those rules. We're very clear about what a security is. And not only did we advance the Howey test, but we added layers and definitions to it, so it's brought up to date and can be easily applied to cryptocurrencies and digital assets. And so we're really excited because this is a first opportunity to talk to so many industry players about what you need, what you want, what's important, and how we can create those layers of safety and soundness and consumer protection so this industry can continue to thrive and can continue to innovate.
Popular ideas. So, will others from your party join you in this?
Sorry?
Will other Democrats see it the same way you do?
Several, and so I've been doing meetings around New York and around Texas, California. Cory Booker attended a bunch of those meetings with me on the West Coast. He's very interested in the access to capital aspects, the fact that this creates opportunities for Black and brown people in America to get access to capital. In the non-digital world, we worked on an idea called postal banking, which was exactly to do the same thing, using post office where anyone can go in, get a bank account, a savings account, wire money. This is the next generation of that. This is beyond bricks and mortar, and so it's equally accessible, but it's the same goal. How do you make sure everyone has access to opportunity and capital? And so there's a lot of people who are interested. I know that Ron Wyden, who's chairman of the Finance Committee, he helped us write the provisions of this legislation around the tax code. And so a lot of his work was put into that. So he's very interested. I know Debbie Stabenow, the chairwoman of the Agriculture Committee, is about to release her own version of the CFTC portions of this bill, right, which I think a lot of those ideas will overlap with our ideas in a very positive way. So I think there's not many who know a great deal about the industry, but there's several who do, and they're moving forward with comprehensive ideas about how to add to this conversation.
Well, speaking of overlapping ideas, we will get to the Congressman, but I'd be remiss if I didn't get around to introducing Senator Toomey. He's been an outspoken defender of U.S. digital assets innovation, and has recently introduced some of his own thoughts on stablecoin oversight. And as the top Republican on the Senate Banking Committee, his views have significant resonance in this space, and he happens to have a sort of an untouchable reputation for his financial knowledge, depth, which makes sense having a Wall Street banking background. So unfortunately, he's retiring this year after his second term as a Pennsylvania senator. But if everybody here is really, really nice to him, maybe you'll convince him to start a new chapter in crypto. Thoughts? Yeah. Not to put you on the spot. So while we're talking about you, let's get your sense of, because you're in this unique situation and you won't be back on the Hill next year, maybe you can be especially candid. What do you think these folks can expect this year and next from DC? Practical terms, like what really comes out, if anything, on these efforts? And we'll let everyone touch this.
Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. It's great to be with my colleagues here who have done some really, really great, Kirsten and Cynthia, great thoughtful work in this space, and I want to congratulate you on your legislation. Patrick, good to see you as always. So I'll go out on a limb here and suggest that in the 1930s, when securities law was written, they weren't really focused on, say, an ICO to help develop a protocol that was going to have tokens distributed and would allow people to run apps that would do, I don't know, file sharing. I'm thinking that probably wasn't at the front of mind in the 1930s. So we've got this problem that we have no framework for a thoughtful, sensible, regulatory set of guardrails that will allow this space to thrive, which is what I think we should have. What can we get done this year? I'm actually more optimistic than most. Maybe that's because this is my last chance. But I think when you look at the various efforts that are underway, legislative efforts, we had Treasury Secretary Yellen before the Banking Committee just this week, I think a couple of days ago. And she was at Finance Committee, she was at Banking shortly before that. I'm on both of those committees. Anyway, she reaffirmed the importance of having a legislative framework so that we can get some sensible regulation off the ground and stop the turf battles that are going on. Let's be honest, the regulators are jockeying for the ability to take claims on this space. And the sooner we pass legislation, the sooner that comes to an end and we provide definitive guardrails. I'm grateful for the comprehensive work that my colleagues have done. My approach has been to take this kind of sequentially. And so I thought we'd try to bite off a piece that I think is really urgent, which is stablecoins. I am very, very bullish about the prospect of further development and actually broader use, including in the physical economy of stablecoins. But we're going to need to have regulatory certainty about that. I know the administration is interested in doing something in this space, and I'm just really hopeful. If you look at what Kirsten and Cynthia have done, it's not very different from the legislation that I've proposed.
Yep.
Right.
On stablecoins,
we could bridge those differences pretty easily,
Very
I think.
easily. Yeah.
And frankly, I think there are folks in the administration who are not far away either. So I'm gonna go on a limb and say we get stablecoins done this year.
Ooh,
Yeah.
that would be great.
That would be so great.
And
So great.
I'd say that's an unusually optimistic view on this, but we'll certainly be watching eagerly for that. Now, you want real talk. Congressman here is going to give it to us, right? What has to happen?
Well, how much profanity can I use? So, not to burst Pat's bubble here. No, look, there's policy and there's process. And the Senate, I welcome the comprehensive bill by a progressive-minded senator and a libertarian-minded senator seeing eye to eye on something. I welcome that. It is a fantastic move. And not only for the space, but our system of government. And it shows that with this dialogue and with the weirdness of digital assets, it's not a libertarian thing, and it's not a progressive thing. It's not left or right, and it really complicates the politics in DC, which means we can get something done. Right? And I welcome that. But the process matters. So it's my intention to chair the House Financial Services Committee next Congress, and it is, as chairman, I will prioritize digital assets. Thanks. And where we began is exactly what Pat said. We have to begin with a stable coin question. There is no federal definition, there is no federal law defining what is a stable coin. It's very important that we get that right. It's very important that we also protect the right for innovation in that space. Number one, stable coins. Number two, we have to have clear treatment of digital assets under federal law. We have securities law, we have commodities law. This thing doesn't fit neatly into either, and what Satoshi brought to this world is new and distinct from what it was before. And we have to make sure the federal law catches up with that new thing that is over a decade old. So the definition and the treatment of that digital asset is a very important thing to get right. That's step 2. Step 3, you have to have a federal framework for the exchange of those objects, of those things. And so we have to get those 3 things right. They're foundational to the additional steps thereafter. And a number of these components are found in the senator's bills. And there's a lot of movement in this space that we can enable. But we will prioritize that out of the House, and you will see multiple pieces of legislation coming out of the House of Representatives. My hope is this year on stablecoins, we're close to a significant movement in a big bipartisan way on stablecoins in the House. And next year, we will have, in the first 6 months of next year, multiple bills that will deal with digital assets that come out of the House Financial Services Committee and out of the House chamber. And the hope is that we can have linkage up on this bigger package next Congress in a major bipartisan way. I'm excited about it and optimistic.
And so you guys have said that you're comfortable with this idea of breaking your own bill into pieces, handling them sort of independently. So that kind of structure, it sounds like it could make sense going into next year. So, well, let me ask you, since this was a bipartisan effort, here's the hard one. What did each of you give up in order to come to agreement on this bill?
We didn't have to give up anything, actually. We came at this with a lot of goodwill and a lot of hard work. There was challenges in getting things right, and that wasn't because we disagreed. It's just an issue of first impression. So the definition of a security is really important, because you don't want to overregulate, but you want to make sure if someone's offering a token in exchange for money to build a company that it's treated like a stock's treated. So it's going to be a security if you're getting equity. It's going to be a security if you're going to get dividends. It's going to be a security. But we had to articulate that very well based on an existing test, the Howey test. And so Cynthia spent a lot of time making sure that we went through every Supreme Court, every Circuit Court decision that talked about what a security is to make sure we incorporated the newest and most up-to-date definition of a security. That took time. There were some issues we couldn't come to agreement on, largely because the industry hasn't come to agreement on, and largely because there is no consensus at all on what to do with it. So, for example, we put 3 things that we thought were worthy of more time and effort into studies. So, for example, we're going to have a study on the digital yuan to decide what is the purpose of a digital yuan. Is it to spy on the Chinese people? Is it to do something else? But we want to analyze that so we can analyze whether we should ever have a digital dollar, and if we did, what would it look like? We are analyzing a couple other things that we think need more, just more consideration, like an SRO. We want to study SROs to say, does this industry need an SRO? And if it does, what are the parameters around it? So we didn't disagree on really anything. We just couldn't come to a final decision on a couple of things because most people we talked to had differing views, and there was no obvious choice. And
SRO is a self-regulatory organization, so that's
Correct.
It's kind of like a regulator that the industry itself stands up, right?
And the third thing was retirement accounts. And we have our own views on it, but the industry hadn't quite gelled on that, and so we put that into a study so we could have more information. Oh, and then the last thing was a progressive issue, is we want to have disclosure of what type of environmental impact your business model has. But we went to the CFTC and said, we want to have disclosures for Bitcoin and Ethereum, and they said, yeah, well, we don't know how to write that. And so our bill has a study that asks FERC, that knows a lot about environmental disclosure, to come up with how would you disclose most effectively and most usefully what the environmental impact is of the energy that you use. And so that's going to give us information to then, in the future, these 4 open items, we could have another piece of legislation to address them, or 4 individual pieces of legislation, but it just needs more information. And so we didn't disagree, we just couldn't get to a clear, perfect answer yet on a few things.
Now, Senator Lummis, do you agree that you didn't disagree?
I do. We did find that the trade associations that have grown up around this industry have their own points of view, and they too are jockeying to have their ideas become embedded in these bills. So we would continue to work with different players within the industry to see if we could bring them closer together. And where we couldn't, we left some things on the cutting room floor. But it had very little to do with strongly held opinions between us or strongly held opinions that are very partisan. In fact, that was never the case. Nope. It was mostly disagreements within this industry that brought about certain issues coming to the forefront and certain issues waiting till later.
And I think that's a very important point. The absolute mess of ideas that are being thrown around in Washington in public policy. We have people that are tweeting about horrible, stupid ideas in Washington that will never work and saying on crypto Twitter, they're really good. You're like, what are you doing? Just because somebody files a bill in Washington about crypto doesn't mean it's good. Call it what it is, right? And so you have all this mix of stuff. So when we're trying to legislate, and we're trying to figure out the proper term of art, legal matter, a legal issue, and we ask 20 different experts, and you have 20 different answers, we realize, you know what? We may want to do something here, but we'll come back to it. And to Pat's point about a stable coin, the reason why we'll be able to move on stables is because there's alignment around the essentials of asset-backed stable coins. Algos are a different deal, but asset-backed stable coins, that regime is a very reasonable one for us to come to terms with. And between the ends of ideas on asset-backed stablecoin regulation, we're about 50% aligned on the most extreme pieces of legislation here. And that's pretty darn good for Washington.
Yeah, it is.
So then we can get into the finer points here of some questions. Who's the regulator? Which are more preference issues than ideology driving those conversations. But the need is there, and there is an understanding among Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate on the basic things we need to do on stables. We got to build that for the definition and the definitional issues around digital assets and the regulatory framework of the exchanges thereon. And that is a very, very complicated task that the 2 senators did a very nice task of starting that process and those deeper conversations.
Patrick, which Democrats in the House are you working with, finding common ground with?
Well, look, for me, my preference is, as a ranking member, to work with my chair, who's Maxine Waters. And from time to time, she and I have been able to legislate together on important things. And if I can get a deal with her, and she's very interested in the subject matter, if I can get a deal with her, then we can move it. Mm-hmm. If I get a deal with lower dais members, the chair may not prioritize the bill. If the chair and I work it out, then we can move, mm-hmm. right? And so what we need to do is originate legislation out of the House so we can start the dance. And that means that we can bring to the end of year package or other options along the way this year so that the senators can come to terms with us in the House. And that's traditionally how it's worked. With the Jobs Act, with the major pieces of legislation, that is typically how we've brought policies out of the House that the Senate has alignment on, and we can then have substantive conversations and work those things out. But a number of the younger members on the Democrat side are very engaged.
There's lots. There's plenty of Democrats.
Torres, Auchincloss are 2 on my committee. They're really interested and deeply engaged, very sharp on the subject matter.
So one of the brilliances of the fact that Cynthia and I decided to work outside the committees is that it's faster. So there are 4 committees of jurisdiction that will have to look at this legislation. I'm on 2, she's on 1. Same thing in the House. So the normal course of legislating is years and years and years of work. And so our goal in putting this piece of legislation out now is to start the conversation now. And I agree with you, Pat. I think we could do a stablecoin bill between now and the end of the year because it's urgent. We just had a financial crisis. We just had a meltdown. We just had a disruption because there's no regulation. And it's not fair for an entire industry to have no guidance or rules of the road from existing regulators to the extent it works. And so that's why I think it's urgent for some work to get done sooner than later. Because if we wait in the Senate for every one of those 4 committees to take their time on the piece of our legislation, it could be a decade. It might not happen anytime in the next few years. Your committee might be ready to go, but the other 3, who knows? In the Senate, we know the Ag Committee is ready to go. They have legislation for one piece of the bill that Cynthia and I wrote, the CFTC piece. We know that the Intelligence Committee, also which I sit on, can do the cybersecurity piece very quickly. In our bill, we require a collaboration between the CFTC, the SEC, Treasury, and NIST to come up with cyber standards and cybersecurity standards. They are best positioned to do that collaboratively, and certainly the Intel Committee can oversee that. You guys are on banking, and are you on finance? You're on banking and finance.
Which is great,
you can speak to those 2 committees because I'm not on those, but it takes a very long time. And so that's one of the reasons why we, as at least 4 individuals, are working together now to move these ideas forward to get things started.
I would just say another reason why it's really urgent and would be extremely constructive to get a stablecoin bill done this year. One is, next year, I think it's almost certain we're going to have divided government. But you know what? It doesn't really matter for this conversation because nothing's going to get out of the Senate that doesn't have bipartisan support. You can't get to 60.
Yeah.
Neither party's going to have 60 after this election, just as we don't today. So that's number one. It's going to have a reasonably broad bipartisan support. Number 2, what makes me excited about this, even though stable coins are admittedly only one sort of silo, it's a really important one, but only one part of this big discussion. Think of how much confidence it's going to give to developers, to everybody in this space. If they see that Congress can come together, pass a bipartisan bill that gets signed into law that provides a sensible, pro-growth framework for regulating and allowing innovation to continue. I think that step alone will be extremely encouraging to the whole space.
Well, let's take a bit of a step back and give some education on DC culture and operation here, because I get the sense that there's going to be sort of a disconnect in expectation from sort of fast twitch crypto world and the timelines that DC is accustomed to. Now, yeah, moving fast outside of committees, makes sense. But then the committees actually do at some point have to get involved, so it's faster on the front end and maybe slower on the back. But can anyone here give a sense to the audience about the kind of timelines we're practically talking about, not just for legislation to get through, law and implementation of regulation?
Sure.
So that, there's...
Sure, the process matters, and it depends how you write the legislation and whether or not you give broad authorities to the regulator to write regulation. So you have to get the law right. So for stable coins, this conversation has started about a year ago in the House of Representatives among a few of us talking through how you deal with asset-backed stablecoins. So those are the quiet conversations you have to sort of have any understanding. We are close, and by close I mean this summer you'll see a bipartisan bill out of the House Financial Services Committee on asset-backed stablecoins. So that will start the process. Now, if we move and we have a broad agreement on this and the chair prioritizes it, you could see that reported out of committee and voted on the House floor before the election, at which point it gives us a November, December conversation with the Senate, along with a government funding bill. And if we can come to an understanding on that legislation, please step in on the Senate side. But that's a pretty fast clip from a bill introduced to it potentially being signed into law before the end of the year. For next year, as chair of the House Financial Services Committee, we will report out multiple pieces. We will report out our first piece of legislation in the first 6 months of next year. And across next year, we'll report out multiple pieces of legislation. The question then is, when can the Senate have a disposition to engage with the House on a House-passed bill? Now, this is not, I'm a bill on Capitol Hill. It's a little more complicated these days to do that. But I've got on the stage 3 former House members. They understand how the House works. I don't have a clue about how the Senate works, even though I've been studying it. But that is how the House typically, under the Jobs Act, which is the best synonym to what we're dealing with here, the House originated about a dozen bills, and then we had alignment with a Democrat president. Republican House had alignment with a Democrat president on about 6 or 7 of those bills, which we packaged up as a single bill, and we sent it over to the Senate. And the Senate had amendments and changes to it, and so it came back to the House. We agreed to it, and it went to the president's desk. That took, from introduction to signing in law, that took 8 months in the year of 2011 to 2012. And that's a pretty fast clip. You could see something like that on digital assets, but that means that the drive for wide bipartisan support has to be primary on the front end, and the House, and likewise teamed up with our Senate colleagues. If we pass a bill out of the House that is Republicans only or Democrats only, I'm interested in what my Senate colleagues say, but they're not as interested in fighting that fight from what we've all seen because of what Pat said, no 60 votes. And so this undertaking between the senator from New York and the senator from Wyoming is this really welcome thing that there is space for legislative outcomes in the digital asset ecosystem that can get through a very complicated legislative body. And so I think it's such a welcome and good thing.
So I would just add that it's a very ambitious timeline, believe it or not, by congressional standards. To get this done by the end of the year actually is extremely ambitious. But the reason that I still think it's possible is partly because we're going to have a champion in this lady right here.
Yeah.
When she puts her mind to something, let me tell you, she is a force of nature. And that's really, really important. And Senator Schumer, her colleague from her state, controls the Senate floor. He's going to have to decide which of the many bills the House sends over he's going to put on, is going to give time on the Senate floor, is going to be having a chance to pass between Kirsten's support for the legislation or a variation on it and an administration that I think increasingly sees an urgency here. And then I think there will be very broad support among Republicans because so many of us are very enthusiastic about the innovation happening in this space. That's the dynamic that I think could get us across the goal line.
I agree.
On stable coins legislation, just to be clear, it's that piece.
The quickest you could get a big piece of legislation like this done is probably 2 years, maybe 1. And the example I will give you is if the public needs something to happen sooner than later, it can happen. So I led the charge on repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Everyone was so frustrated because men and women were dying. Men and women are being told they can't serve because of who they love. The moment was there, and so it got done in a year and a half. But that was the biggest piece of LGBTQ equality legislation probably ever, and it mattered, but it was an urgency that was driven through advocacy. So for the people in this room, you can help determine how quickly this takes. If you are urgent and you are eager to participate, you have to get involved in your local states and let your representatives know how important it is that you want safety and soundness, that you want transparency, you want accountability because you want this industry to thrive in America. You can be heard on it. So urging effort now can be achieved through your actions and through your voices and through speaking out. That's how we get anything done quickly. When it's an issue of important significance for the economy or for really any reason, you can make it happen. You just have to push and you have to ask.
But even the most urgent situations, thinking 2008 financial meltdown, it took, 2 years? admittedly an extremely complicated piece of legislation, the Dodd-Frank Act. It took about 2 years.
18.
Yeah, but the bailout immediately only took, like, let's say 6 months. So things can get done, but the American people have to want it done, and they have to ask for it, and they have to ask their representatives. So being active politically matters. It really does. And Silicon Valley usually doesn't want to get involved politically. Lawyers don't like to get involved politically. Bankers don't like to get involved politically. It's not the thing. So for all you brilliant tech people, like, now is the time to get involved. If you want this space to thrive, you have a say about that.
And I know all of you are extremely familiar with not only the legislative process, but what happens after a bill becomes law. And that is actually where much more time, as you know,
you have to keep refining it and making it work.
Agencies have to propose rules.
Yes.
They have to go through comment periods. This can take an extremely long amount of time, a year, 2 years to get something out.
It can, but when there's a legislative framework that's laid out there that says this is the basic direction that we're going to go, even the regulators can start looking at it and begin to regulate in a manner that would be complementary to a legislative framework, even though that framework has not yet passed.
I would also say, look, that's part of our job, to have the legislation sufficiently precise and well-defined so that they have relatively few holes to fill.
Yep.
And we really should do that. If we do our job right, there's not all that much that the regulators have to figure out, and so it doesn't take them as long.
Just in the cold water department, there was in Dodd-Frank the incentive compensation provision that all the financial agencies in the U.S. were supposed to write this rule by law. How long? 12 years late, I think. There's still no sign of it.
It's also a dumb provision. So, look, on this, as Senator Toomey said, as the senators have said, it's really important that we get the definitions right, that we get every piece of precision language correct. And if we can't do that, then we shouldn't do it, right? And I think, Kirsten, you laid that out very well. If we can't get it exactly right, then maybe we'll take a pause, and maybe it's better that we do it later if we can't get it right. So I think it's incumbent upon us to actually draft correctly, and the wider group of policymakers we have on the left and the right working together means that you can get into those details and do it precisely, rather than to try to jam a more narrow outcome, right? And if we have a firm, thoughtful process, we get a better policy outcome. The reason why we have bad law under the infrastructure bill definitions around digital assets is because it was a chaotic process.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful that we had senators that said, we have to go fix this, and time is of the essence for us to fix it. With additional time, we have better language. And that I think, and we see that in the House bill that I'm leading, and also in the provisions that Senator Lummis is taken into account, and what you two have legislated. So these things really do matter. And then it makes sure that we have to push the regulators in a tight timeline about the biggest issues to be done more quickly than the smaller issues.
So in the latter minutes here, let's run through some topics as rapidly as we can. And I think first up, and obviously a major ongoing issue, is central bank digital currency. So just opening it up, what do you guys think of the digital dollar? Is there a place for it or not?
In my opinion, wholesale, yes. Retail, no.
Yeah, I would say I don't have a reflexive absolute opposition to this, but can't be retail accounts. The Fed can't have any ability to surveil individual transactions or activity. It would have to be an open source code so that developers could build on it. But I think the best case scenario is it would take 5 years for this to come about. In the meantime, a thoroughly flourishing, innovative stablecoin marketplace probably obviates the need for a CBDC.
Yep.
Amen.
Yep.
Yeah. So you want to see an extended period of time for anything, ask the Federal Reserve to do it, right? So, I mean, admittedly, I think it was Vice Chair Brainerd just the other day predicted the 5-year timeline for getting that in place. So,
and why not try to get the other regulation up and running so you give stability to the rest of the market before you decide that? That decision doesn't need to be made today. All these other ones really do. People want to get regulation. They're asking regulators to regulate them and not receiving any replies. They're waiting up to a year to get a response. It's too much. And then different state regulatory agencies, unfortunately, are having to take all of the responsibility, and they don't have the resources and staff. I mean, just in New York, I mean, just issuing the ability to be part of the New York market is difficult. The regulator doesn't have enough staff to get timely responses for people who want to register. So the federal government has to do its job. And so we are obligated to get this done as quickly and as best we possibly can, because otherwise you're putting too much pressure on state regulatory agencies. And there's whole parts of the market that are asking for regulation and are still waiting for it. It's frustrating. People can't do business. And so that's why it's important that we do our jobs.
Regulating by enforcement action is no way to go. People have to understand the rules of the road.
So now you mentioned state regulators. A lot of the firms are obviously regulated at the state level, such as in New York, or are establishing new types of relationships, such as they are in Wyoming these days. So as the feds weigh in with new rules, will the states' roles diminish to some degree?
No. I mean, New York State has some of the highest regulation on every issue you want to talk about, whether it's healthcare, environment, financial services. Our state and federal work hand in glove, but a lot of our state regulators need federal oversight so that they can take some of the burden off all the work they're doing for safety and soundness. It's just, it has to work hand in glove. It always has done well, but you need both. You know, certain industries are regulated by the state only, things like insurance. But for securities and commodities, those are federal regulators. We have to do the work to get that created.
So you mentioned regulation by enforcement, a very unpopular phrase around here. Do you think it's appropriate for the SEC and CFTC to be, obviously you already answered this, but to be sort of guiding the industry in this way? And I know you guys just met with Gensler, right? Chairman Gensler at the SEC on your bill, right? And how did he receive your legislation?
Well, we've stayed in touch with him. We've stayed in touch with the CFTC, the OCC, the White House. We've stayed in touch with senators, members of both parties, the industry, because all of these players need to interact. So we don't want to ignore anyone. The SEC is now looking at it. Gary Gensler hasn't read the bill, but he will now because finally it's filed. He's not looking at an iteration of the bill. He's looking at the filed copy that now he can really respond to with some certainty about what we'll be going forward with. So I'm optimistic that we use the best definition we could possibly find to separate what is a security versus what is a commodity. And because of that, the regulators that are going to be the primary players in this will have an opportunity to go through and look at the portfolio of cryptocurrencies from the biggest ones, Bitcoin and Ethereum, to the very smallest new ones. And the new ones are almost always assuredly securities, because they're being offered initially as an offering. So they'll be able to look at these and see if the definition that we have proposed is going to make their jobs doable and appropriate. And if they find they won't, hopefully they'll come up with a better definition. I think that it is our job as Congress to set the stage, set the tone, set the direction, and for the regulators to take their cues from us, not the other way around.
I just want to pause and say it's not obvious to me that an ICO is necessarily a security. That it's very reasonable to, in my mind, to consider that a separate and distinct category. It might be necessary to have some kind of regulatory framework on it. But what I disagree strongly with Gary Gensler on is his position that with the possible exception of Bitcoin, everything's a security. Well, just think of the chilling effect that has. A developer goes to bed at night not knowing whether there's going to be a knock at the door in the morning, because the implication is, he's engaged in illegal securities offering. So I think clarity on that is absolutely essential after we get stablecoins done.
Right.
So I think we may have just time for one more issue. I'd like to raise customer assets custody. What may have been meant as sort of a routine disclosure to the SEC the other day from Coinbase led to some industry soul searching.
A staff bulletin should not be regulatory enforcement. It's the most insane thing I've seen the SEC do in a long, long time.
So apart from the procedure there, what about the issue?
All the securities regulators, all the financial regulators should agree on a framework for holding digital assets, and they're not doing their job. So Congress will have to step in and legislate to protect these assets like we protect every other commodity, security, and every other property right we have in the American economy. And what they're doing is going willfully counter to property rights and ownership rights in our American system of government. So we have to fix it, and we have to be very clear that these assets can be held by these platforms or exchanges, just like Vanguard holds one share of Apple for one of their clients.
Offering it to raise money, like a stock, then it's a security.
Any other thoughts on custody?
I agree with Patrick.
They're not.
So whether the crypto world likes it or not, something, and it sounds like everyone wants to see this, something is coming from DC at some point. And the industry can either get with you folks and offer input and help make it happen, or watch it from the sidelines, right? But I think everybody agrees it's going to have massive consequences. So let's give our guests a great big round of applause.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much for being here.